What is up, health enthusiasts? It's Coach Lambie here for Working Weights LLC, your guide to strength, health, and all things nutrition. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Dwayne Ulrich, aka Poppy Dwarrell.
Hey,
Today, we are talking about why we celebrate the 4th of July.
good podcast. Good podcast.
Yeah, so we're going to deviate a little bit today. And every holiday comes up, and I'm always like, man, we should have done something for that. I'm always behind on it. I never post anything for social media either. I don't know. Just seems to be the thing. But I managed to plan ahead. So we're recording this early. It's going to drop on the 4th of July.
Awesome.
And so we're going to talk about why we celebrate the 4th of July. We have this national holiday, and most of the time we get 4-day weekends for it. People barbecue, we have friends and family over, and as I watch social media, it's a bit discouraging to find that they do the man on the street things and go around and ask young people, why we celebrate the 4th of July. And there seems to be this forgotten reason why this is a holiday. And I do love this country. I think this is the greatest country on the planet. It was
Absolutely.
ordained by God.
Amen.
And we need to remember why we celebrate this holiday. So, the 4th of July is celebrated in the United States as Independence Day. Now, it commemorates the day when the Declaration of Independence was adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4th.
Second Continental Congress.
Second Continental Congress, July 4th, 1776. That is the birthday of this great nation.
That's right.
So this document declared that the 13 colonies were to be free and independent from British rule, making it the birth of the United States.
Yes.
4th of July is celebrated, like I said, with all of our various festivities, including parades, fireworks, picnics, and family gatherings. And it is supposed to be to honor our country's independence and to promote our ideals of liberty and freedom. A little sippy sip there. All right, now, we know that we had a Revolutionary War. Well, some people don't know that we have a Revolutionary War. All right, and we had the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which was a big deal because these people at the time were basically signing their own death warrant, right? By signing this declaration and sending it to the king, they were basically signing their own death warrant. They say, this is my name, I'm endorsing this. And before the Revolutionary War, so it didn't just happen, right? We didn't just decide one day that we wanted to be our own country.
That's right.
There were several things that happened up to that point.
That's right.
Now, this is, where it all starts can be debated, whatever, but here's just some regular old info that you can find on the internet. So the first thing that we may think that happened was the Stamp Act. All right. And a lot of these things are probably going to refresh in people's mind. You've heard this in grade school or high school or wherever it was. But the Stamp Act was a tax, and it was imposed by British Parliament on the American colonies, and it was in 1765. And it required all printed materials in the colonies, like newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards, to bear a stamp that it was purchased from the British authorities. The purpose of the tax, amongst many of these other taxes, was to generate revenue from Britain because they were in debt. So they're trying to come out of debt from the French and Indian Wars. Now, the Stamp Act was met with strong opposition from the American colonists who believed that they were being taxed without consent. taxation without representation.
Representation, absolutely.
And this tax is seen as an infringement on their rights and a violation of the principles of no taxation without representation. So colonists organized protests, boycotts, and demonstrations, and arguing against the Stamp Act that only their own colonial legislature had the right to impose taxes. Listen, you can't impose taxes from all the way across the sea on us. Only the people here can do that, right? We've appointed people to be in government here, and they can do that. So the opposition to the Stamp Act eventually led to a coordinated effort among the colonies to resist British taxation and assert their rights. And the Stamp Act Congress, which held in 1765, brought together delegates from 9 of the 13 colonies to draft a statement of colonial rights and grievances. And the protests and resistance against the Stamp Act played a significant role in paving the way for the American Revolution and the eventual independence of the United States. And so in response to the colonist resistance and economic pressure caused by the boycotts, the British Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. This didn't fully resolve tensions between the colonists and the British government, and further conflicts dispute, and all that led up to the American Revolution. So something else that happened, the Townshend Act, or Townshend, not sure how to pronounce that.
Townsend.
Yeah, so these were a series of laws passed by British Parliament in 1767. Oh, that fella's done. So they kind of went from one thing to another, right? From 1766, 1767, they just passed another thing. So these acts were named after Charles Townshend.
Mhm.
And he's the chancellor of the Exchequer. I'm not sure how to pronounce that at the time. And the purpose of the Townshend Acts, again, was to impose taxes and tighten control over the American colonies. The Townshend Acts placed taxes on various imported goods, including glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. And these taxes were intended to raise revenue for the British government and assert dominance over the colonies. Additionally, these acts established new systems of customs enforcement in colonies, which allowed British officials to search private homes and businesses for smuggled goods without a warrant. And this is one of the reasons why we have a amendment. Is it the Fourth Amendment?
I'm
Against
embarrassed to say
seizure?
I can't remember. I should know. Holy
Look
cow, I
it up.
should know. I'm looking it up now.
Okay. All right, so as he's looking that up, so similar to the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act faced strong opposition from American colonists, and they saw these acts as just another form of taxation without representation and violations of their rights. So they organized boycotts of the British goods and protests against the Townshend Acts. And that eventually led up to what people might remember is the Boston Massacre. And this was a significant event that took place on March 5th, 1770 in Boston, Massachusetts. And it was a clash between British soldiers and a group of about 200 American colonists. And this took place outside of or rather the British soldiers were haggling a wig maker, right? And so then a group of colonists started to gather around, and they started pushing back against the British soldiers and eventually began throwing stuff at them. And so what happened then is that the British soldiers, eventually got overwhelmed and started firing into the crowd.
Before we move on, Fourth
Yep.
Amendment against search and seizure. I should have known that.
Yep.
I couldn't remember if it was fourth or fifth, but I apologize for my lapse in memory.
Yeah. The Fourth Amendment protects us against that very thing that the Townshend Act enabled, right? Which is illegal search and seizure. You have to have a warrant to go into people's personal property and to seize their stuff.
Right.
All right. So the soldiers, feeling threatened, eventually fired into the crowd. 5 colonists were killed. including a person named Crispus Attucks, which was an African-American sailor who became an important symbol of the American Revolution. And the Boston Massacre became a rallying point for colonists and further fueled anti-British sentiment. It was widely publicized throughout newspapers and pamphlets, which portrayed the incident as a brutal act of aggression by the British soldiers against innocent civilians. The event increased tensions between American colonists and Britain, contributing to the growing desire for independence. And the Boston Massacre also had legal consequences. The soldiers involved in the incident were arrested and they were put on trial. They were defended by a prominent Boston lawyer who went by the name of John Adams.
Yep.
He later became president number 2 of the United States. And the soldiers were ultimately acquitted of murder charges, but 2 of them were found guilty of manslaughter and received reduced sentences. So the trend of our legal system being a little bit lenient on crime goes back a ways.
Way back.
All right. So
way back.
yeah, and what I've done here is I've kind of just chosen 5 significant events, right? There are many that led up to it, but these are kind of the 5 that we learn about in school. And these are important to remember because we need to know why we are an independent country. All right.
Yep.
So last but not least here, I think this is last but not least, we have the battles of Lexington and Concord. All right. These were the first military engagements of the American Revolutionary War. They took place on April 19th, 1775 in the towns of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. And tensions between the American colonists and the British government had been escalating for years. The events at Lexington and Concord marked a turning point in the conflict. The British government sought to assert control over the colonies and enforce laws and taxes, while the colonists were increasingly discontent and seeking greater autonomy. On the night of April 18th, 1775, a group of colonial militia members known as the Minutemen received word that British troops were planning to march from Boston to Concord and seize a cache of weapons and ammunition stored by the colonists. In response, the Minutemen gathered in Lexington to confront the British forces and protect their supplies. The next morning, on April 19th, a small British detachment arrived in Lexington and encountered a group of about 70 militiamen and on Lexington Green. The exact sequence of events is still disputed, but a shot was fired and the British soldiers opened fire on the colonists. Several colonists were killed and wounded while the British continued to march to Concord. In Concord, the British forces faced resistance from a larger group of militiamen, and the colonists engaged the British troops in skirmishes at the North Bridge and throughout the town. And as more colonists arrived, the British forces found themselves outnumbered and began their retreat back to Boston. The retreat from Concord turned into a harrowing ordeal for the British soldiers as they faced relentless attacks from colonial militias along the entire route. The colonists used guerrilla tactics, ambushing the British and inflicting significant casualties. And by the time the British reached Boston, they had suffered heavy losses. And I think this is kind of what's the movie with man, I can't think of his name now. Mel Gibson. What's that movie with Mel Gibson?
You mean Patriot?
Patriot, yeah, The Patriot. So I think that movie is kind of based on this series of events from Lexington and Concord.
Right.
And the battles of Lexington and Concord were significant for multiple reasons. They marked the first military conflict between the American colonists and the British Army, symbolizing the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. And the events were galvanizing support for the colonial cause and led to an increase in militia activity throughout the colonies. Furthermore, the battles demonstrated that the colonialists were willing to fight and resist British authority, setting the stage for the long and arduous struggle for independence that would follow. The spirit of defiance and determination displayed by the colonialists during the Battle of Lexington and Concord inspired others to join the fight for freedom and ultimately led to the birth of the United States of America. So that's my prepared speech there. Yeah, so, you know, the 4th of July isn't just about hot dogs and hamburgers and having a weekend off. It is about remembering um, the bravery of men and women who came together to fight what was the strongest military force in the world at the time. The British naval force was
Unmatched. It was unmatched.
it was unmatched. For what was available to the world at the time, it was basically just a never-ending supply train to fuel this war machine for British to conquer majority of the world, pretty much.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. A lot, a lot.
So there are significant events that happened before and during the Revolutionary War. There are significant events that happened before that, like the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock and just happenstance to come across the only Native American who spoke English at the time, right? So there are any number of events that we can say, listen, there was divine intervention, that this country was meant to be um, and give us the freedoms and the liberties that we have today.
I love what you said there was about divine intervention. One of the things I would like to just add to this is just a couple of things. But one of the things I want to add to this is like we often talk about the birth of a country, birth of our country. And when you think of birth, think about a woman who goes to the childbirth in labor to birth a child, and there's pain
Mm.
and it's in difficulty and as a guy, we really can't get it. I mean, the
Mhm.
closest I can figure is, I had a kidney stone. I've said it all, but it's like, okay, the pain is tremendous.
Mhm.
And so the birth of our country came at the blood of innocent people, not just the Minutemen, but innocent people as the British went from town to town, killing, murdering, burning houses. I'm sure there was some other war crimes that was going on that don't need to be spoken.
Yeah.
But that's a pain. That's a birth pain. My wife and I, we got to go see we went and saw a movie um, yesterday, and I'm not advocating a movie or whatever, but we saw this movie and it just highlighted things that I had never heard about or had you know even thought about. The movie was called um, something to stand for, and it highlighted the battle at Fort McHenry, um, when ultimately when Francis Scott Key penned the song for our national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. But the events that occurred were crazy. So there was a doctor. He was um, he was abducted, taken on board of one of the ships, one of the British ships, because they were incurring injuries. Some of the soldiers were getting shot and getting hurt, and so they came and abducted this doctor, and he was taken aboard this British ship. Well, not the full battle hadn't broken out yet. In the midst of that, also Francis Scott Key, who was a lawyer, he was he was procured to come aboard the ship to argue for the release of this doctor. So they're both on this British ship before the battle even begins. In the meantime, the British were coming. They were on the land. They were advancing. They were moving into cities, and there were two boys, two teenagers, who had heard about all this, and they're like, "Yeah, no, we're not playing with that." They were teenagers, just teenagers, and they were hiding behind a tree or a rock. And there was a general, prominent general, from the ships, and he and his crew, he and his soldiers were marching and going along. And of course, he's on this magnificent horse, and all the soldiers are walking. And these boys ducked from up behind a tree, and they shot this guy. Didn't kill him, but it was a mortal wound. So he was taken back to the ship so that the doctor could operate on him, try to save his life. In the meantime, the Minutemen, the soldiers of I just vapor locked the colonists basically. They were working. They were building up Fort McHenry in preparation for this battle. If the British had attacked then and there, this would have been over. It would have been decisive.
Dwayne used to
But
be a
it
teacher, everybody.
Yes, I used to be a teacher. So anyway, so they were building up the fort. Okay. Well, so the British delayed their attack in the length of time it was taking this doctor to try to save this general's life. Well, general died, and uh, it, it's kind of crazy because what they do, they need to preserve the body, so they stuffed his body in a barrel of rum and stuffed him down in there, and so that's going to preserve his body for him, I guess. So in the meantime, then here comes they begin their attack, but Fort McHenry was prepared, and the fact that Fort McHenry and the surrounding military factions for what would become the United States, they held off the greatest naval armada in the world, as well as the British soldiers that were on the ground. They held them off. And so Francis Scott Key on board of this ship, because he was a prisoner at that point, and he's looking out the porthole or window. They didn't have porthole; they just had a window, and he's looking out there through the night. And towards morning, they didn't know how the war was going, but the flag was still flying at Fort McHenry, and that's when he penned the Star Spangled Banner.
It's
All
so
of these things had to come together.
yes.
It was divine intervention. It's just there's too much coincidence there to make all this happen. Starting from these two boys to the delay of the attack because this guy's trying to save the general's life. Francis Scott Key's on the boat. Fort McHenry was able to arm itself. There you go. It's too many coincidences. Divine intervention.
Yeah. It is somewhat funny that you bring up that uh story about Francis Ski
Scott.
Scott
Scott
Key.
Key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So because we're gonna end the podcast with a telling of the story of the Star Spangled Banner.
Awesome.
And it brings a tear to my eye every single time.
Ditto.
So, as you guys celebrate the 4th of July, remember that this is remembrance of our Independence Day and the heroism and the bravery of those before us who decided to stand against tyranny and fight for our freedom.
I think it's only, I know you have some, I know you want to move on, but I think it's only fitting to also include the warriors that have fought over the years for our truth and for our freedom. And people say, well, why'd they fight? Why did you fight over in there and over in there in these other countries? Because the very idea of oppression and dictator rule is like a cancer and it spreads. And sometimes you have to take the fight to that. And so 4th of July, we want to also remember our warriors over the years, through the world wars, through Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Kuwait, Afghanistan. And remember what they stood for, their patriotism and their belief, not in just in a flag stands for.
Indeed. So on that note, as we all attend celebrations this weekend, and we always every 4th of July, we'll fly the flag. Everyone will turn to the flag and place your hand over your heart. We'll all recite the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. So I want to leave you all with this video on the telling of how that came about.
There was a lawyer once. His name was Francis Scott Key. He penned a song that I'm sure you're aware of. You've seen it. It's in most hymnals throughout our churches. It's called the National Anthem. It is our song as an American. We go, however, to a ball game. We stand in our church services and we sing the words of that song, and they float over our minds and our lips, and we don't even realize what we're singing. Most of us have memorized it as a child, but we've never really thought about what it means. Let me tell you a story. Francis Scott Key was a lawyer in Baltimore. The colonies were engaged in vicious conflict with the mother country, Britain. Because of this conflict and the protractedness of it, they had accumulated prisoners on both sides. The American colonies had prisoners and the British had prisoners. And the American government initiated a move. They went to the British and they said, let us negotiate for the release of these prisoners. They said, we want to send a man out to discuss this with you. They were holding the American prisoners in boats about 1,000 yards offshore. And they said, we want to send a man by the name of Francis Scott Key. He will come out and negotiate to see if we can make a mutual exchange. On the appointed day, in a rowboat, he went out to this boat and he negotiated with the British officials. And they reached a conclusion that men could be exchanged on a one-for-one basis. Francis Scott Key, jubilant with the fact that he'd been successful, went down below in the boats, and what he found was a cargo hold full of humanity, men. And he said, men, I've got news for you tonight. You're free. He said, tonight I have negotiated successfully your return to the colonies. He said, you'll be taken out of this boat, out of this filth, out of your chains. As he went back up on board to arrange for their passage to the shore, the admiral came and he said, we have a slight problem. He said, we will still honor our commitment to release these men, but it'll be merely academic after tonight. It won't matter. And Francis Scott Key said, what do you mean? He said, well, Mr. Key, he said, tonight we have laid an ultimatum upon the colonies. Your people will either capitulate and lay down the colors of that flag that you think so much of, or you see that fort right over there, Fort Henry? He said, we're going to remove it from the face of the earth. He said, how are you going to do that? He said, if you will, scan the horizon of the sea. And as he looked, he could see hundreds of little dots. And he said, that's the entire British war fleet. He said, all of the gunpowder, all of the armament is being called upon to demolish that fort. It will be here within striking distance in a matter of about 2.5 hours. He said, the war is over. These men would be free anyway. He said, you can't shell that fort. He said, that's a large fort. He said, it's full of women and children. He says, it's predominantly not a military fort. He said, don't worry about it. They said, we've left them a way out. And he said, what's that? He said, do you see that flag way up on the rampart? He said, we have told them that if they will lower that flag, the shelling will stop immediately. And we'll know that they've surrendered, and you'll now be under British rule. Francis Scott Key went down below and told the men what was about to happen. And they said, how many ships? He said, hundreds. The ships got closer. Francis Scott Key went back up on top and he said, men, I'll shout down to you what's going on as we watch. As twilight began to fall, and as the haze hung over the ocean as it does at sunset, suddenly the British war fleet unleashed. He says the sound was deafening. There were so many guns that there were no reliefs. He said it was absolutely impossible to talk or hear. He said suddenly the sky, although dark, was suddenly lit. And he says from down below, all he could hear the men, the prisoners, saying was, tell us where the flag is. What have they done with the flag? Is the flag still flying over the rampart? Tell us. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours into the shelling. Every time the bomb would explode and it would be close to the flag, they could see the flag in the illuminated red glare of that bomb. And Francis Scott Key would report down to the men below, it's still up. It's not down. The admiral came and he said, "Your people are insane." He said, "What's the matter with them?" He said, "Don't they understand this is an impossible situation?" Francis Scott Key said he remembered what George Washington had said. He said, "The thing that sets the American Christian apart from all other people in the world is he will die on his feet before he'll live on his knees." The admiral said, "We have now instructed all of the guns to focus on the rampart to take that flag down." He said, "We don't understand something. Our reconnaissance tells us that that flag has been hit directly again and again and again, and yet it's still flying. We don't understand that." But he said, "Now we're about to bring every gun for the next 3 hours to bear on that point." Francis Scott Key said the barrage was unmerciful. All that he could hear was the men down below praying. The prayer, "God, keep that flag flying where we last saw it." The sunrise came. He said there was a heavy mist hanging over the land, but the rampart was tall enough. There stood the flag, completely nondescript, in shreds. The flagpole itself was at a crazy angle, but the flag was still at the top. Francis Scott Key went aboard and immediately went into Fort Henry to see what had happened. And what he'd found had happened was that that flagpole and that flag had suffered repetitious direct hits. And when it had fallen, but men, fathers, who knew what it meant for that flag to be on the ground, although knowing that all of the British guns were trained on it, walked over and held it up humanly until they died. Their bodies were removed and others took their place. Francis Scott Key said what held that flagpole in place at that unusual angle were patriots' bodies. He penned the song, "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming. O'er the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that the flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet fly and wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? The debt was demanded. The price, it was paid."
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets spread clear, the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land